Carolyn Mazure.
Thank you. Okay, thanks. It's such a pleasure to be here with you all today. Please excuse my laryngitis. Yeah, don't do that to me while I'm trying to talk. Of course, can you? No, this is great. Of course, whenever the speaker comes up, Alan's making faces at them, so it's very hard not to be distracted. Nonetheless, it's a pleasure to be here. And what I'd like to talk about today is how I first met Alan also. I was a graduate student, and Alan taught the course on methodology and design, like with Elliot. And it was the best course that I ever took in graduate school. It was also the hardest course I ever took. He would teach us a whole variety of things, and I'm going to talk to you about that a little bit. But I wanted you to know as well that he really has had an enduring influence on me in terms of my reading, in terms of, and by the way, I should show you this, Alan. If you want to sell your Campbell and Stanley, you can get $128 for it now on Amazon. Who said you can't get wealthy as an academic? He's also influenced me in other ways and just sporadically in terms of the way I dress. And I can't believe I gave you that picture. But most importantly, as I think many people are saying today, Alan really influenced me in terms of my thinking. And in particular, I wanted to mention that he really always taught us about critical thinking. And by that, I don't mean criticism. I mean rigorous, systematic thinking. And also, as we see here in the slide, something that many people have reflected on today is not just thinking about programmatic research, but also research that winds up producing positive change. So back to the graduate school course on design and methodology, Alan's assignment. So it sounds pretty similar to what you were saying, Elliot. So he would teach us these various designs, and then our assignment was to go to the library and find published articles that actually showed in a particular design threats to internal or external validity. Do you know how many articles you have to read to find that? You have to find a lot. And so we went to the library, and that was, of course, before the time that everything was online, so we went in the stacks. And I learned a few very, very interesting things along the way, a lot about method, a lot about rigor. But what I also noticed as I read so many articles is that I thought, in my perspective, that women were often unrepresented, or at least underrepresented in a lot of psychological studies. And moreover, when tests or assessments were normed, they were often normed on men. And then when women were assessed with those measures, they didn't perform as well as men did. And that really piqued my interest in sex differences research. And you may all know that the prevailing tradition in science, really into the mid-1990s, was largely not to include women in clinical trials. And also, when women were included, because there were disorders that had high prevalence of women, depression, my own field of study, was certainly an example of that. When women were included, we tended not to analyze the data by gender. And so if you look toward the bottom of the slide, I think most of us would agree that this is a reasonable working premise for all of us in science, that we want to improve health and health care through new knowledge that we derive out of experimentation, out of empirical science, and then we want to incorporate that into our practices. To give you an idea of the extent of this, I just want to show you this one slide, if I may. It's the first trial of estrogen as a secondary prevention for coronary heart disease. The most extensive effort testing lipid-influencing drugs, because estrogen lowers lipids. It was done on 8,341 men, no women, 5-year trial. And not surprisingly, there was an increased risk of unwanted effects compared to placebo. And the trial was ended early, and that was 1973 in JAMA. But to give you another couple ideas, the first randomized trial of low-dose aspirin was done entirely in men, 22,071 men. It did show something very important and very useful, and we're very glad that this study was done because it showed that there was a decreased risk of a first MI So this is primary prevention. Decreased risk of first MI by 44% in men who were greater than 50 years of age. And there was a trend that maybe it might increase the stroke risk. Now, after that was published, a lot of men were started on so-called baby aspirin, but there were big questions about whether or not women should be started on that. And basically, at that time, people largely said, well, certainly women aren't going to have a different reaction to something like aspirin, so we may as well say to women, you know, you could take a baby aspirin as well. Well, it took 16 years that the Women's Health Study was done with low-dose aspirin in 39,000 women, and we got the opposite effect. So something, a compound that presumably is as simple as aspirin, we now find that it's the younger women less than 65 years of age, where aspirin lowered the risk of stroke, but it didn't affect coronary artery risk, and it was the older women who had the same preventive benefit with aspirin. So I mention this in terms of cardiology because cardiology is often used as a classic example of this, but it is not in cardiology alone or in any one discipline. It's really pervasive across many, many areas, and you can go into studies in surgery, in psychology, in dermatology, in medicine, and you're going to find this pretty much everywhere. Change came about, though, in the mid-1990s, as I mentioned, and it came about because of a relatively small grassroots effort to make change in the way in which NIH would fund studies. And the clinical equity provision was a provision that was put into the 1993 NIH Revitalization Act. And it was signed by President Clinton in June of 1993. And as you can see, it requires that women and minority persons be considered as subjects in NIH-supported trials. For those of you that were writing grants at the time, I remember that, and I remember people being upset about that and saying, we can't do that. That's going to cost too much money, it's too hard, there aren't that many differences anyway. Alan and I knew David Kessler quite well, who was the dean of the medical school. I'm based over there. And you may know that David Kessler, of course, was the head of the FDA. And when he first came here as dean, he said to me one day, you know, people keep asking me, is there a difference in the pharmacology of drugs between women and men? And I don't have any data on this. And do you think there really is? And I said, yeah, I kind of suspect there is. But the key is we're going to have to do the experiments, and we're going to have to include women and look at differences. And the reason that the NIH was the focus of this grassroots effort is not going to come to as a surprise to anybody in this room. It's that in '86, the NIH wisely had passed a guideline. Now, we all have written grants, so we all know what guidelines are. But the guideline encouraged, it didn't require the inclusion of women. And the question became, well, is it really happening as a function of that particular guideline? The General Accountability Office, then called the General Accounting Office, which is the investigative arm of Congress, at Henry Waxman's request, did a study on this. Henry Waxman from California, I was a fellow for him on the Hill, and he was quite the bulldog, even though he never has an association with Yale, but he was really great. He would pursue something to the end of the road, no matter what. And what he found through the GAO report was that this really wasn't happening. And to NIH's great credit, they reviewed the same data and they agreed. And so they kind of came on board with the fact that we were going to need a rule, we were going to need a requirement. And the reason this was so important is because, as you all know, it's the largest single source of biomedical research funds, probably in the world. I mean, it depends on how you count pharma, but if you're talking about this largest single source, it's really an enormously important source. And also, it's very influential. The reason I have laryngitis today is because we've been writing a Senate grant that went in yesterday, and it's been kind of, 18-hour days, and you get kind of tired out, and you work real hard at it because you want the NIH money. It's good money, it's important money, it's prestigious money, and it forces you to write good science. So all of that's very good. Now, one of the things I want to mention that I think is particularly important for me personally is that in addition to critical thinking and not just building programmatic research for its own sake, but also doing it so that you can make practical benefit, Alan really encouraged me to be bold. I can remember conversations at Willoughby's over coffee where he's saying, "You have to be more bold," and I would say, "Okay." uh, So one day I decided, oh, all right, he's right, I should be more bold. So I thought, well, maybe I could change the landscape of research and really help everybody to study women and to study sex and gender differences. So I was very fortunate in that I came in contact with a private foundation that believed in this and believed in what I was trying to do. And I got a very large grant from them. And I started what's called Women's Health Research at Yale, which is the interdisciplinary center here at Yale, again, based in the medical school, but not exclusively, where we really try to foster research in this area. One of our earliest people that we funded in a pilot study, by the way, was Peter Salovey. So that turned out to be a good investment. He thinks this is a great program. But we have 4 major initiatives that are part of Women's Health Research at Yale. First, create new research. Second, train the next generation of researchers and clinicians. Third, develop translational educational outreach. I think Kelly is somebody who I've always talked to about the importance of, and I guess as he said earlier today, we are very good at educating ourselves. We have to educate other people about what we do and why it's important. And we also are committed to nonpartisan public action. So I would say, first of all, is that bold enough? But we've been doing well over the last 20 years. Now, you're not really meant to read this whole thing, but what it describes is our pilot projects. And if you look at one, researcher has an idea, you go around the circle, needs funding for data to test an idea, can't seek large grants without some data. This is critically important in women's health because in 1998, there weren't feasibility data. There weren't pilot data in many, many, many fields. In cardiology, in autoimmune disease, in all of these areas. I can remember having discussions with colleagues at the medical school where I would say, but you're only running male mice, and autoimmune illness is almost entirely more common in women than men. And they would say, uh-huh. So what we wanted to do was we wanted to attract people with an incentive, and the incentive was a pilot project. And so I spent this large grant over years and raised more money to continue this pilot project program because it really was very exciting, and we got an enormous response. The first RFA that went out, or should I say now POA, that went out, we got 80 full applications, like NIH R01s, and still to this day we moved to letters of intent after that. We learned our lesson, and we still get 60 to 80 on average from different fields. And just to give you an idea of the diversity of this, these are just some of the studies we have funded. We've funded now over 20 years, over 90 studies. And we've used $5 million to fund these studies. Researchers have gone out, done their feasibility studies, and they have brought in $95 million of new money into their own labs or clinical research settings to continue the work they've started. So the whole point is these are not one-off studies. It's not designed to be anything but hopefully changing the fabric of research in these various labs. I wish I had the time to tell you even about some of these studies because, again, like Wendy was saying, my passion is actually talking about the work, and really I get so excited when I get to talk about these studies. And I actually have an advisory council, and when I get started talking about the studies, they have to interrupt me, and so we have to get to the business. But the studies are fantastic. They're being done by people from all over the university in interdisciplinary collaboration. Mark Salzman from engineering is working with Alessandro Santine in OBGYN on nanoparticles and ovarian cancer, and the list goes on and on. I want to mention just one study. So the list of studies that I showed you represent a compendium of the studies, the portfolio that we have. I would say approximately 55 to 60% of the studies tend to be laboratory or basic science studies. Part of the reason for that is I've always tried to play to our strengths, and the medical school here is really a temple to molecular science. And so you're going to get great science in molecular work. And so we want to fund that, and it's terribly important. And so I would say a little less than half of the studies are clinical studies. The clinical studies and the molecular studies can be rather complex. This actually, I wanted to show you because it's not complex. It's a simple idea. And this is Pamela Ventola, who you may know is an assistant professor at the Child Studies Center. She studies autism spectrum disorder. And she came to us in our RFA and said, look, there's this great therapy called pivotal response therapy, which some of you may know. And part of the reason I wanted to show this is because it was about kids. And her description of the study, as I understood it, was that rather than kind of rote learning, it was really an interactive social therapy where the clinician is well trained to systematically reinforce appropriate behaviors like eye contact or verbalization. And it seemed to work extremely well in boys, was developed on boys, but it had never been tested on girls. And also, as you know, when we were back in the day of thinking that things were black and white, one had autism, one didn't have autism, before we moved to a dimensional view, it wasn't believed that young girls, very many young girls actually had autism. And as we looked at the spectrum, we started to understand that girls could present in slightly different ways. And even though the prevalence, as I understand it, is still so much higher in boys than girls, what you find is that for girls, it's not really, if the prevalence, if the y-axis is prevalence and the x-axis is severity, with boys you find a rather flat function. With girls, you find that there's kind of a blip at the end. So in other words, proportionately, within girls, there's a higher percentage of girls who have more severe disorder. And Pamela wanted to use this therapy with girls, but it had never been empirically tested. So we funded her to do this. Not only did it work, the net improvement was greater for girls. The baseline was lower in girls, and it brought them up to where the boys were able to function. So at the end, the boys and the girls were functioning at about the same level in terms of social interaction, but the girls benefited even more than the boys. And this, I know, is a simple example. It's not molecular science, and it's not more complicated Greco-Latin designs of clinical trials, but I think it stands as one of a very kind of parsimonious example of what you can do when you think critically and try to make positive change. I've embedded my own research in this work. I've been very devoted to the issue of depression, which we all know is, and Dr. Kessler's in the room, so he could talk for much longer than I on the importance of understanding depression. Stress and depression has been very important to me, and we've woven that into the larger picture of the center. I would point out, as I mentioned earlier, that this issue where women and men are not well balanced in terms of how you think about your sample sizes relative to the percentage of individuals in the population who have the disorder. And one of my postdocs, Andrea Weinberger, had gone and looked at the data, and she found that in ongoing trials in the year 2010, 89% of those reported recruiting men and women. So the NIH has been successful. A lot of these were NIH-funded trials. And it was any intervention, any psychological or pharmacologic intervention for depression. And of that 768 studies, that was the 89%. There was only 1% that talked about intent to analyze by gender. So we have a long way to go. Also, women remain underrepresented in clinical trials of cardiovascular disease and cancer. And in laboratory studies, they were not included in the 1993 NIH Revitalization Act, the clinical equity provision. It was only in January of 2016 that the NIH started requiring that animals, tissues, and cells that are female or to be typed must be included. And you only have to talk to basic scientists to know that they're really trying to lay the foundation, the basic model for what's going to be transferred over to human science. So what do we really know? Well, I think in the last 20 years, we've learned an enormous amount about sex differences and about women's health. And I think that we also are quite aware of the fact there's an enormous amount more to learn. Now they're saying shiny things attached to hooks are bad for you. So is this another issue of we're just reversing ourselves? I think not. I think what we're actually doing is science is evolving and we're improving on the science. We're getting better at it. And established and emerging data clarify clearly, I think, for all of us, that sex and gender differences exist in the prevalence of different disorders, in risk factors, in presentation, course of disorders. We can give a lot of different examples of that. Men and women have osteoporosis, but there are huge sex differences in regard to osteoporosis. As I mentioned, autoimmune illnesses, thyroid disease is 15 times more common in women than men. Lupus is 9 times more common in women than men, and more common in African American women. Pain, I mean, Roger Thoyam can show you that there's just an enormous difference in pain response in women and men. Response to treatment can vary. Our own work in smoking, I got interested in smoking because so many people who are depressed also smoke. And in smoking, there are big sex differences in terms of whether women and men will respond to the same treatment. Prevention strategies, they also often need to be gender specific. And somebody mentioned Google earlier, and I think it was Mitch, right? And in 1998, you couldn't Google because there was no Google. But if you could have Googled, and you Googled women's health, you would have found that it was conflated with reproductive health. That's all we thought about when we said women's health. And I think we're changing that, and that's really important to do, because women's health is reproductive health and so much more. And this is from David Page, who's at the Whitehead and a colleague of mine. He's a geneticist. And I want to end with this slide because I think it's really very important for us to all be thinking about. So what David has shown and others have shown now is that traditionally we think about the function of the sex chromosome. So in most cells, you either have an XX or an XY. Notice I said most, and I'm not going to get into the whole issue of the spectrum there. But in most cells, you get an XX and an XY. The sex chromosomes were always thought to affect hormone production in your body, which they do. And that defines secondary sex characteristics, and it defines body habitus, it defines all of these things. What David and colleagues have shown is that, in fact, if you look at the autosomes within the nuclei of every cell in the body, you find almost identical information with regard to a whole variety of different behaviors that, I shouldn't say behaviors, I misspoke, in terms of processes that then result in biologic outcomes. And the point is that the sex chromosomes are telling the autosomes how to read the genome. And so in a very, very fundamental way, from the nucleus of the cell to overt behavior and kids who need help, we really, in my view, have to start being bold and thinking about sex and gender difference in a serious way. So I want to thank Alan very much from the bottom of my heart for his help in helping me to think rigorously, critically, to really value taking research and trying to move it to make a difference, to actually have a practical impact, and probably most of all, for being bold.